Welcome to all of you to week 8 of our journey through Paul's letter to the Romans. Thanks for your hard work this last week. I know you had a full plate with a good passage to study in the second half of Romans 8, peer reviews, finishing up your interpretive working papers. I hope that you found the peer review process to be helpful in kind of raising the level of your work before you submit it, and just getting the chance to hear from one another about how other people are making sense of what you've written. This week we are diving into a really demanding section of the letter. I guess that's maybe goes without saying in Romans. It's all demanding. But this one's demanding for new reasons in some ways, because it's really notorious for some of its language about predestination, God's election, which, as you might guess at this point, picks up quite directly on the thread that's ending at the end of chapter 8. But now, with respect to some of Paul's relatives, some of his Israelite relatives that are hostile to the people that he's sending this letter to, who are primarily of non-Israelite background. And, that situation that Paul is addressing pastorally often fades from view in the interpretation of all the election language in Romans 9 to 11, especially in chapter 9. And I think that's been a great shame, to be honest with you, because it leads to all kinds of distortions of what Paul is teaching if we neglect the concrete pastoral situation that he's addressing. So for once, I'm not inviting you to listen to a podcast. I may end up making one anyway as an alternative, but what I've actually assigned is some reading, including a chapter of a book that I wrote. And it is a chapter that deals with Romans 9 to 11 from beginning to end and offers an interpretation of the passage. But it's in a book that has a larger set of concerns than simply the interpretation of the passage as we're doing it in this class. It's a book about Christian commitments in relation to modern projects of peoplehood, modern countries, which usually now have the form of nation. And I've tried to engage that development in the world, which is so kind of second nature to us now and geopolitically dominant, tried to engage that critically, and to draw on Paul's teaching in Romans 9 to 11, to do that partly because of how God's election has been invoked historically, especially by white European Christians, to justify their projects of nationalist revolution, the violence that's been involved in that, and also the conquest and genocide that have been part and parcel of that kind of political movement by Euro-American Christians historically, and with all kinds of, I think, vestiges that are still present among us. So I did give you a link to the introduction to the book so that you might be able to frame the reading of this chapter with the larger argument of the book. In case that helps, that's optional. But while I hope that the chapter does help you to track with what Paul is saying in Romans 9 to 11, I suspect that in some places it will be a little bit confusing because you're parachuting into the last chapter of a book and haven't read the preceding 6 chapters and how they've sort of tried to set up this last chapter. I hope that it's still worthwhile reading, obviously, but that's why I might also provide a podcast as an alternative or something if I can this week. We'll see. In order to track well with what Paul says in this section of Romans, I think I need to say a word about what we mean by Israel, and then to reiterate something about the pastoral situation that he's addressing. And that will probably be what occupies the remainder of this intro video. So Israel, when we think of Israel today, we often think one of two things. We think about this ancient Near Eastern people that we read about in the Bible, or we think about the modern nation state of Israel that has now a territory in the Middle East and was born as a modern country in 1948, even though the significant Jewish migration to that region began 80 or so years before that, especially with Jews fleeing the oppression that they were enduring at the hands of Christians in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Now, the nature of the modern country or state of Israel and the larger system of nation states that it is a part of leads us to sort of intuitively assume that when Paul's talking about Israel, that's what he's talking about. And I think that's a mistake. And if you read all of what Paul is talking about in Romans 9 to 11 as if he's dealing with the modern nation state of Israel directly, then I think you will come to some really distorted conclusions about what he is teaching. And there's a lot of that current in a lot of our churches, I'm afraid. So I don't mean to exclude the Jewish population of the modern state of Israel from being incorporated in our minds in what Paul means by Israel. I think that is probably appropriate, actually, to include them in that sense. But I don't think that we want to reduce what Paul means by Israel to them, because Paul was not talking about people that, part of whom would form a nation state almost 2,000 years after he wrote his letter. He's talking about the sprawling, very diverse people that descend in all kinds of ways through procreation and birth, but also through adoption, through all kinds of changes historically, drama, crises, everyday mundane life. They just descend through all kinds of means from Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, who is named Israel, become 12 tribes, settle mostly in the promised land, are eventually exiled after they themselves are divided. Most of the 10 northern tribes are dissolved by being assimilated by Gentile peoples. Some of them form a remnant that is called the Samaritans. And then, of course, you have much of Judah also dissolved in foreign peoples by being invaded and then exiled by Babylon. But many of them persisting across generations, retaining a memory of who they are, and that's who the Jews become. And in Paul's day, he's part of what's left of the Jewish community that is dispersed around the known world, and still remembers the promised land as its own, even though it does not enjoy what we might think of as sovereignty there, but is being oppressed by Rome, occupied by Rome. It's all of these diverse people who, what they have in common is very difficult to define. It's not just genes. It's not that they're all faithful. They're not. Israel in the Bible is not characteristically faithful or something. It is that they all call out to the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as their own in one way or another, and have managed by God's grace to avoid extinction or being assimilated and gobbled up by other peoples, and still know themselves as part of this historical intergenerational sprawl, which of course has continued since Paul's day over many generations down to our own, where a good deal of the population of the planet now calls out to the God of Abraham as their own, and a good part of them as to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as their own. And this is the sort of reality that Paul, I think, is talking about as Israel. And of course, the readers that he's addressing have recently been adopted into this great, diverse, sprawling family so that they know Abraham as their ancestor, their father. They're inheriting what was promised to his descendants. And Paul has already been arguing that the lifeblood of this family that conveys that inheritance and hope across time is faith as a gift of God, as opposed to something that people who have called out to the God of Abraham can claim about ourselves or claim as our own achievement or something like that. So that's what I think Paul means by Israel. And I know that's probably complicated. I try to explain in the chapter how this is something that can be traced and known only in retrospect. It doesn't obey criteria the way that we often think. We often imagine that Paul is talking in Romans 9 to 11 about some true Israel versus a false Israel. I think that's wrong myself. I try to argue against that and show that Paul is talking about Israel and all of its moral, doctrinal, and other kinds of ambiguity. Nevertheless manifests God's gracious election, purpose, mercy. And of course, now I'm getting to the second part of what I want to say in this video, which is that the situation Paul is addressing is some of his relatives who are Israelites like he is. We don't know how many of them he's talking about. We can't say that it's the majority of Israel or something like that. We don't know everything that they think about Jesus. All we know from the passage is that in Rome and perhaps beyond, they have become enemies of the non-Jewish people that Paul is writing to, and that those people feel probably threatened by them and are tempted, these non-Jewish readers of the letter or hearers of the letter, to regard themselves as having replaced Paul's relatives, as having now been chosen by God to the exclusion of these relatives of Paul's. And Paul, as I understand, is arguing against that way of understanding God's election. This is a kind of extension of the sort of boasting that he's been warning against earlier in the letter, and that instead he wants to impress upon the people he's writing to that God's election has shaped these relatives of his to remain part of the family, to remain among those who are calling out to the God of Israel, even in their disobedience, even in their faithlessness. And that this is not something that the readers should take as some basis for their own superiority or celebrating their fate as their achievement or something. It's instead a call for them to recognize a kind of mysterious work of God that is unfolding among these relatives of Paul, that Paul gives an account of. But most of all, that it's a call upon them to reflect in their way of treating these relatives of Paul the same mercy that they have been shown by the God who chooses Israel to be the people that it is in all of its messiness. So that the pastoral effect of Paul's account of election is a call for hospitality, patience with particular kinds of enemy in this case. So if we lose sight of that rhetorical aim that I think sustains the entire argument of Romans 9 to 11 from beginning to end, then we will pull from this section all kinds of crazy ideas about predestination and God's election and whatnot that I just don't think are what Paul is teaching. So here's to another round of reading Romans in a way that tries to track with Paul's unfolding rhetorical purpose, section by section, paragraph by paragraph, and not losing sight of that and allowing it, even though it's sometimes frustrating for us to follow, to govern our interpretation of what Paul is saying. Looking forward to the conversation this week. Hope that the material is illuminating for you.